Welcome, welcome, welcome to Bridging the Gap. I am so happy to be here with you. I am Bishop Vanessa Brown, and I am here from Rivers of Living Water United Church of Christ in New York and New Jersey. And I am here having this conversation today with the great Professor Crawley.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. I am excited to have you here, Dr. Crawley, on today. Again, these conversations, and people are saying, well, why are you starting this? Because I want to talk about HIV. I want to talk about COVID. And these are part of an HIV vaccine trials network where they are coming to people who are part of the faith community
Yeah.
and saying, you need to have these conversations. Will you
Yeah.
be willing to be an ambassador? Will you be willing to have these conversations? They are courageous conversations. There are things that should be said or should have been said a long time ago. And so you're here with us on today. I know that you're going to help us do that. Tell us about your work. First of all, you can introduce yourself to the audience of Facebook and YouTube and about your work around HIV as well.
Thank you for having me, Bishop Brown. Ashon Crawley. I'm from East Orange, New Jersey, born and
Woo,
raised,
woo, woo. Yeah.
public school baby, K through 12. I moved to Philadelphia when I was 18 for undergraduate studies and did not too well. Took 5 years instead of 4 years to finish. I stayed in Philly for 2 extra years after I graduated. Then I moved to Atlanta for seminary, went to Emory University for my seminary training. I thought I was going to be ordained, and I decided not to do that after my first year and instead focus on some other things. And at the same time, was really trying to read deeply about things like prison abolition and learning more about race and racialization and its relation to spirituality. And then I left there and worked for a nonprofit for a little while, which I never named it because, yeah, it was not a great experience. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot at the nonprofit organization. Then I left there and I attended Duke for my doctorate in English and was there for 5 years. Then I moved to California to teach in California, University of California, Riverside, ethnic studies. And then I left there after 4 years, and I've been in Virginia at University of Virginia since 2017. So that's kind of like a professional bio, but I'm also, I was born and raised in the Church of God in Christ. My father's a pastor. My mother is a missionary evangelist. My brother was a minister and a musician at our church. And then he went to college, and then I became a musician at the church. And when I moved to Philadelphia, I started the gospel choir at University of Pennsylvania, the New Spirit of Penn. And I was playing for several churches in Philadelphia, playing the organ. And just always was very musically inclined. And so part of the work that I'm doing now is trying to reconcile a lot of the musical genius that I experienced in sort of the Black church world in terms of music and musicality. I think the Black church is an amazing space of sonic possibility. I learned how to listen to the world intently through my experiences of attending not only my church in Orange, New Jersey, but churches in that we fellowshiped with in New Jersey, in New York, in Connecticut, but also the churches we would fellowship with nationally and sometimes internationally too. It gave me a strong way to sense through vibration and sound how spirit moved and operated. And so I was always deeply moved by the music and musicality of the Black church. But at about the age of 8 or 9, I was born in 1980. So 1988, I began to notice a lot of the people who were causing the congregants to worship through their musical practices, through the songs that they would write, or the playing of the Hammond organ, or the piano, or the directing of the choir, or the singing of the solo. A lot of these musicians would eventually disappear. And at a young age, I didn't understand what the disappearance was. And then the older I became, the more the disappearances turned into whispers about people.
Yes.
And the older I became, also those whispers turned into just explicitly stating that people were dying. And a lot of the people who were dying were men who were contracting HIV. Not only men, but certainly men
Yes.
at an alarming rate were contracting HIV, and they were dying of AIDS complications. And so a lot of the musical practices that we were experiencing, the folks who were giving us a reason to dance and shout, the folks who gave us a soundtrack so that we could speak in tongues and worship, were also dying. And I could not understand why there was no real conversation about the disappearance of these people.
Yes.
And it was also one of the primary reasons I did not want to be a singer, musician, choir director, because I was young and I didn't understand things like causation. And all I could see was that there was a deep relationship between the people who were providing for us music and the people who were dying.
Yeah.
And I did not want to die. And I knew that the people who were dying were also people that folks would have hushed conversations about and call pejorative terms and call negative terms, always pointing toward a kind of queerness that was considered to be abominable, to be sinful, to be leading people to hell. And so I didn't want to be a musician because I didn't want to be a sinner. I didn't want to be a musician because I didn't want to be gay. I didn't want to be a musician because I didn't want to die. And so at a very young age, trying to navigate the love of and appreciation for the sonic practices, while at the same time thinking that the sonic practices were the reason why people were dying, was very, very difficult. And so now, having done, a lot of the internal work and theological work and social work and, working with friends and therapy.
Yeah.
Part of the work that I do, I'm a writer in addition to my teaching practice. I'm a writer and I'm also a visual and sound artist. And so I've done several, I'm writing a book currently about the AIDS crisis and how it impacted Black communities in the United States between 1980 and 2005. And I do a really long history of historical failures in terms of governance, in terms of theology, to lead up to the 1980s and the AIDS crisis, and why during the AIDS crisis that emerges in the 1980s, our church is unwilling to actually deal with the fact that it is a public health crisis and not a crisis of morality. It's a public crisis and not a crisis of individual failure to live up to a standard of a theological conviction, that people were actually unwilling to ask the question about what does this mean about God, and instead
still a public health crisis.
And it still remains.
It still remains after 30 years.
After it remains a public health crisis. And one of the reasons it remains a public health crisis for Black community is because there's so much silence and shaming around health and a deep misunderstanding of health. And so sickness, for a lot of people in certain kind of theological orientations, believe that sickness is the fault of the individual and it is a sign of sin. And it is a sign of being sort of out of harmony with God. And so because that idea was really pervasive, when you have all of these primarily, but certainly not only cisgender men dying, it was considered for so many people to be their individual moral failure to live up to a standard of what, in the Pentecostal church we would have called holiness. And so I have been trying to do work in terms of my writing, but also in terms of my artistic practice. I had an installation at the National Mall last year. It was a part of a 6-artist installation. It was the first of its kind ever in the history of the United States. 6 artists were selected to put installations on the National Mall for a month. And mine was titled Homegoing, and it was a 3-stage sound installation that also had platforms that you could sit on. And each of the stations, the first stations was titled Procession, which was a 14-minute song that had me reciting the names of approximately 305 people who died of AIDS complications by 1993. So it was very early period of primarily Black men who had died of AIDS complications, saying their names, releasing their names, their first names only, releasing their names into the atmosphere to begin to set a kind of sacred and solemn atmosphere for the installation. And the second section of it was titled Sanctuary. I wrote 4 songs for a choir to perform, and I worked with a music producer who found singers that could sing in a choir. Songs that I wrote were all based on 3 musicians who I knew who died of AIDS complications by 1995. And I took 2 songs from each of the 3 musicians, and I used a unique word finder to find words from their lyrics to become the lyrical basis for the songs that I would write. And I also used the chord changes and the chord progressions that were common in their songs. And I repurposed those chord changes and progressions to be the foundation for the 4 songs that I would write for the choir to perform. And so in that second section, it was about 20 minutes of music that people could listen to. All of the songs were written to the musicians, singers, and choir directors who died of AIDS complications. They were not written to God or about God intentionally, but the songs sounded like, because of the chords and the Hammond organ, they sounded like songs you would hear on a Sunday morning church service, and that was intentional. And then the final section was titled Benediction, which was a 12-minute song where I read passages from some of my writing to honor the lives of these musicians, to think about life, to think about love, and to think about deep connection. And so both in my artistic practice and in my writing practice, I'm trying to produce occasions to really reckon with what has happened in the past, to really honor the complex lives of the individuals that were lost, an uncounted number actually of musicians, singers, and choir directors that was lost, to really hopefully point toward a future where that loss doesn't happen again.
And when you say they were lost, because I want to really name it, they were lost because of why?
They were lost because of unkindness, because of religious homophobia, religious-based queer antagonism, the refusal of people in religious circles to really contend with the presence of queerness, not as sin, not as failure, but the presence of queerness as a gift to our communities. Like, what does queerness actually present to us in terms of the possibility for living? Because churches, but not only churches, were unwilling to deal with the presence of queer people as complex individuals who were suffering with a health crisis. These people they died often alone. Families would, for a lot of these men, would not go to hospice care, wouldn't go to the hospital. Congregants of the churches where these musicians played would not shake their hands, wouldn't give them hugs after they had just played for the church service. There was so much unkindness that these musicians experienced. I interviewed several people for this project. And one of the people I interviewed, she was telling me about a musician in Texas and how he was one of the best musicians she'd ever heard. And he was one of the first musicians that the community knew was living with HIV and dying of AIDS complications. And she said they would go to like these musicals and he would play, and people would say explicitly, don't play the organ after him because you know he sweats and you don't want to get sick like he does. It's like the casualness of the unkindness was so stunningly clear how harmful it was. And so in the book that I'm writing, I actually use unkindness as one of the major theoretical contributions, because you can't count unkindness, you can't quantify it, but people feel the impact of what it means to have been the recipient of unkindness all of the time. And so like that one musician is just one example of the various musicians, singers, and choir directors who experience this kind of trauma within spaces that were also spaces of care, love, and joy, and spaces where they literally produced labor for the community.
I have 2 more questions.
Sure.
So to the church,
Mm-hmm.
there has to be a way that we can reconcile and heal.
Yeah.
What remedy
Mm-hmm.
in your mind? And it's not the one thing, I'm pretty sure it's several things, but something that you can give the church that they can actually do to really, first of all, reconcile with what they've done.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's some repentance that they need to do as well.
Yeah.
But then now, what can we do to move forward and heal?
So I think one of the first things we have to do is we have to be honest about what happened. We cannot. And I think that there's a deep connection to COVID, actually, because in 2020, the Washington Post published an article about the Church of God in Christ and how many bishops who died of COVID complications.
Absolutely.
And the next convocation, because I'm nosy, I still watch some of the clips that people online. Mm-hmm. There was like a person who was singing who said, all of us didn't die of COVID, and then started singing. And I'm like, I don't understand, in a literal sense, I don't understand how you say this within the context of a collective body that has lost, not because of the fact that they lost so many bishops, which means they lost leaders. It also means that there is an uncounted number of parishioners or lay people that these congregations also lost. And so the kind of cavalier response to COVID, all of us didn't die, it's like, sure, that is true, but that actually doesn't allow us to reckon with the loss that we have. We haven't grieved. And so I think that the impossibility of grieving COVID is predicated on the impossibility of or the inability to grieve the fact that we lost so many people during the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s. And we continue to lose people to HIV and the AIDS crisis today. And so I think the first thing that is necessary is a real reckoning with the past. We have to talk about the songs that you sing on Sunday today.
Yeah.
Were written by men who died alone of AIDS complications and fully dejected from their churches. It should be a moral and ethical crisis.
Yeah.
That people can continue to sing the music of people who they denounce and find in that music praise, worship, and the capacity to shout. Like, not that the music lacks it, but there is this inability to actually contend with what does it mean for us to continue to listen to and to continue to perform and to continue to use this music as the foundation for praise, the music of folks who have died, who we still will not honor the fact of their queerness. We will not celebrate the fact of their queerness. We will still denounce them. And so if that first part of reckoning and telling and speaking truthfully, if that doesn't happen, I really do not think there will be a real capacity to move forward in justice, equity, and honesty, because I think we have become habituated to silence or habituated to lying, like telling just an untruth about who it is that we are in order to get to the next day, to move forward to the next day. For this writing project, I have talked to several people, musicians, lay people, friends of people who died, family members of people who died. And the amount of people who have said to me, I have never talked about this before. This person died 30 years ago. I've never talked about it. I've never talked about the fact that we lost him. This person was a father figure. This person was a brother figure. This person was my lover. People have not talked. And so we haven't had a collective moment to grieve.
Yeah.
Like, we can't grieve if the only time these musicians are even mentioned is to dismiss them.
Yes.
It's to say that there's something wrong with them, that there was something lacking in them. And so I think that we haven't actually been honest, and that the lack of honesty then produces the foundation upon which the lack of grieving has not. And so we've not been honest and we haven't grieved. And so those two things for me are the most urgent needs: the honesty about the past, because the honesty about the past is actually about being honest about the present too. Queer people still here.
Absolutely.
And like, you know, a lot of these churches are suffering because, you know, so many more people are like me today than there were in the 1970s, I would say. When, or like the late 1960s, when gay liberation was a new movement.
Sure.
That today more people are willing to say, actually, I don't got to go to church.
Exactly. And I'm not going.
And I'm not going.
And I'm not going. I'm going to brunch.
And it's not just like I'm spiritual but not religious, or but it's like, or like I have a personal relationship. There are people actually choosing other traditions. They are actually thinking about congregation in a much more expansive way. And so I think that a lot of churches are suffering because, and I don't think the reason to deal with queer people in the church is because you're losing members, but I do think that the losing of members is a symptom of a problem of having never attempted to reckon with what are these theological messages that we're telling people in the first place. Who do we think God is? Why do we continue to think God is a person who primarily exists to punish most of us? Because if that is who we think God is, a punitive and petty person, then we can be punitive and petty with one another. Exactly. We need to actually reorient our understanding of who it is we think God is supposed to be, and also reckon with the fact that there are other traditions in Black community that ain't Christian, and we can actually be in community and communion with one another. And so I think that, you know, the reckoning or the truth-telling part is necessary, and the grief. Like, there's so much. Writing this book and doing this art project has been so grief-inducing, because in the actual writing of it and the research of it and the planning for like the music of it, I just recognized like, oh, like this, no one's like, not that no one has ever talked about this in the history of the world, because you have, Bishop Flunder has, like,
of course,
this is possible. The work that I do is possible because of the work of like of Ark of Refuge, like literally in a very literal, and you know, Ark of Refuge beginning in the late 80s. Like that it's what makes possible the kind of critique that I can make. But it's like, we are 30 years from there, and it feels like I left the church in 2025 in Philadelphia. Theologically, that church is in the same place as it was in 2025 in terms of in 2005 as it was
20 years ago.
When I'm thinking about like queerness, it's like, oh, you think the same thing? Like, there has been no growth, there has been no
growth, no evolution, no revelation.
That for me is like, I don't know how that's possible. Like, it doesn't feel honest. And so those two things about like actually being honest, and not honest so that we can figure out how to correct you, how to change you, how to make you straight. No, but like an honest reckoning with what does it actually mean to think about affectional orientation as expansive and creative and as a gift of the divine that goes in multiple directions and that necessitates things like consent, which Mary didn't get to have. I don't want to talk about the Hebrew. The Christian Bible, but Mary didn't, doesn't.
No, she did not.
She didn't say no. Like, you're not going to say no to the angel. So it's like there are so many ways that the language and the theologizing does a disservice if we do not enter into the text with a kind of critical relationship to it, if we are not suspicious of it, if we are not willing to ask it more questions than did this literally happen? Like those things I find to be really unhelpful. Yes. And so trying to move from the place of honesty to the place of grieving, so that a real process of grieving, of lamentation, of of thinking about what are the foundational structures through which this loss was not registered.
Yes.
How can we understand what those foundations are so that we can reorient ourselves against those foundations so that we don't keep producing loss within the context of we don't have to think about it, we can just move through it. And so I think once those two things are done, then we can begin to have the conversations about like HIV as a thing that you don't have to die.
That's right.
To live with.
That's right.
And yeah, so I feel like I'm rambling.
No, but that was good because you talk about this toxic theology.
Mm-hmm.
And it's happening across our pulpits, of course, more viral than ever, right? Because people are getting on their platforms. One person in particular I could think of just is that Jackie Hill Perry person. Yeah. And, you know, I guess it's that kind of theology that makes people try to, you know, crawl back into a hole someplace.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It's repressive. I don't know much about her, yeah. But I know that recently she's kind of been on these little tour things and she's been talking, and it's been difficult to listen to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Difficult to know that so many other people are listening to it. And I bring it up because in particular, young people, yes. Young adults as well, you know, who I know that are, you know, living the best possible life they have and that yeah. They can live as queer persons, yeah. But to hear someone like her and others,
yeah.
What do we say about this?
You know, that I have a lot of feelings about that because I find it deeply angering when people build platforms and sustain those platforms by refusing to do the work of interrogating their own theology.
Yes.
There's a lot of money, in other words, in going viral for saying a lot of homophobic things.
Absolutely.
And targeting those homophobic things to yourself. And so on the one hand, it makes me very, very angry, folks like Jackie Hill Perry, who will, you know, make declarations about how we need to be living and how God requires people to give up everything for him. And it's very important that God for her is him. It's a very gendered, patriarchal yes. Way to think about one's place in the cosmos. And so on the one hand, it makes me very angry because there are so many young people and older people too, who are just like,
of course,
I think that they want an alternative, but they are not in spaces that cultivate a critical a critical care for interrogation, for questioning, for uncertainty. And so the questions that I'm sure that they have, like when I was 10, there was no one I could talk to. I think it's like the hardest thing for me to have reckoned with in this writing is there was no one that I could talk to when I was 10 or 15 years old. No one. Like, because to say anything, I'm noticing people dying. Why are you paying attention? Or I think I might be. Why? Right. Let's pray for you. So like there is, even when you have questions about other people's certainty, there feels like there is no space, no room to go in order to figure out. And so on the one hand, it makes me very angry because people do go to the internet to try to find alternatives. And because of the way algorithms work, her and there's so many others who are not as famous as her, but who have been very, very recently publicly testifying, I was gay, but God delivered me from being gay. Still attracted to the same gender, but God delivered me. And I'm like, I don't actually understand what you think your deliverance is if you also concede that the thing that you are tempted with, the thing that remains with you,
still remains.
It makes me angry, but I'm also like really heartbroken for people like her.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Regardless of the prominence of her platform,
both ends,
it's always like very apparent to me that there is a kind of internal struggle and longing that is not reconciled. And it's like when Donnie McClurkin, I'm not a huge fan of his, but I try to take at least people seriously. And, you know, in 1989, there was a recording in Detroit of Ron Winans' Family and Friends 2, where Marvin Winans writes the song, The Word of God, which is a deeply terrible song, with all of this homophobic language that Twinkie Clark was singing. And like, yes, terrible song. But to recognize that Donnie McClurkin was 25 to 29 in 1989, and that Marvin Winans was not only his pastor, but his friend. It's like, how did it feel for Donnie McClurkin to be in the same place, because he also recorded on that same album? How did it feel for him to hear a song that one of his best friends writes, that's about the horrors of queer people in Detroit, Michigan, which is experiencing the HIV and AIDS crisis in 1989 in an intense way amongst Black people? It's like, why did we allow this to happen? And then, like 30 years later, Donnie McClurkin is on BET, and he's like, I would love to be married. I would love to be in a relationship, but I don't know how. I feel like I would fail. And so I feel like God has just called me to like be single. And I'm like, it is heartbreaking that he feels that he has to live his life in this kind of posture of lamentation and unfulfillment in order for him to like do the thing that he thinks God is telling him to do. And that, I think that is the same for Jackie Hill Perry, and I think it's the same for so many of these folks. And so I'm like heartbroken, and I'm also really angry because the folks who have alternative ideas are not platformed in the same ways. And I mean, like, we create our own platforms, we push,
but it's not the same.
But it's very different. And so like, I want to like shake them and say, no, you don't have to live this way. You don't have to this and what is necessary is to reorient ourselves to what we think God is supposed to be in the first place. But I think that the reorientation to the question of God is actually really, really, really scary. And it's one that perhaps people are not willing to engage, because if the certainty of that, which isn't actually certainty, but let's pretend for a second that if the certainty of that goes away, I think people really wonder, so what will I be? Who will I be? Where will I go? You know, so yeah.
Will I have community? Because we've seen what they've done before. Will I have community? Will I have family? Will I have loved ones? Will I have anybody who's going to love me?
That's right? It's not inconsequential. It's not an inconsequential question.
It really is.
My second book is titled The Lonely Letters, because one of the things is like, you know, I am not trying to go backwards theologically or doctrinally at all. I have no, you know, I'm very happy over here in agnostic. Oops, sorry. I'm very happy over here in agnostic land. Very happy. But there is a lack of community. And I talk with friends about this often, that you do lose things. You lose friendships, you lose family. People are very committed to very harmful doctrines and theologies, and they are willing to let you go.
And I think the question is, to someone who is in that space, are you willing to lose everything possibly? Right? You know, are you willing to lose the family? Are you willing to lose the friends? Are you willing to lose community? You know, and I think people find it so hard to do. You know,
this is why I empathize so much. It's hard because it's also like, you know, one of the difficulties of queer relationship is that sometimes you are in relationship with people who are uncertain about their own doctrinal commitments. existence.
That is correct.
And so tomorrow they might wake up and say, you know what,
We
the
don't
Lord.
know where it's going to take them, honey. Tomorrow,
And,
I might just be going, I got to go back. I can't handle this. I love you, but I got to go back.
And that's
real.
That's not, I have experienced people like that. And so I empathize deeply with, I don't want to lose what it is that I have.
Yeah.
The problem, however, for me is that I think what they are also admitting is I actually don't have the thing that I think that I have.
Yeah.
Because if I can lose mother, father, sister, brother, if I can lose friend, if I can lose the thing that looks like care because I am honest, then I don't have care. I don't have love. I have a very tenuous relation to something called community. But I can't actually show up for it. I can't be full. I can't be myself, which means they also are not themselves within the context. So it's a lot of refusing to tell the truth about our own capacity, about our own questions, about our own desires in order to be with others.
Yeah. Sorry. I have someone in my life whose father has not talked to them in 10 years.
That's wild. Yeah.
They are 28 years old. They came out at 18. In 10 years. Their father has not uttered one word.
That is disgusting.
This kid has graduated from college, has gotten a master's degree, has gotten a clinical license, has bought his own car, pays for his own insurance, has his own apartment, has a great job, just was recognized on his job. But their father has not spoken to them in 10 years just because they came out as a gay man.
That is, I mean, it's unfortunate how sadly common that is. Yeah. And I lament for this person.
Sure, I do too.
And I'm also like, it makes me very curious about the father, because it makes me say, what is it that this child triggers in you?
Yep.
And I will just say, based on the research that I've done,
sure,
the thing that it would not surprise me if one of the things that is being triggered in the father by the kid is the fact that the father probably gave up his own desires to try to live a certain kind of way. And so some of these I refuse to talk to yous are really based on jealousy, on envy, on
this kid was like a prince.
Say it again.
He was like a prince. You couldn't tear them two away.
Yeah.
Right. So close. Like I can remember that kind of on the shoulder, like just there, like everything. And there was never an evil word spoken about the father when the parents separated. None of that stuff. Never. And they remained close until he said, "I am a gay man." And that was it.
That kind of animosity, that kind of, and also that ability to cut someone off so fully.
Yeah.
It lets me know that there's a deep trauma because it's impossible to do. It's not possible to do that when you care about somebody. Absolutely. And I don't think that he didn't care or doesn't care about his son. I think that there has to be something else that is there.
Yeah.
I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not trying to psychologize. I'm just saying that it's just the evidence, the evidence of that kind of withdrawal. It illustrates, it underscores that there is something there that the son is producing in the father, and the father is refusing to deal with the son because then the father would have to deal with himself.
Sure.
And I think that the magnitude of that story, or the regularity of that kind of story, is something that we also don't know how to contend with. I'm an abolitionist, though. I don't believe in punishment. I believe in honesty so that we can reckon, so that we can figure out ways to not harm one another. And so the reason why I want to tell the truth is not to say, so it's your fault and everything is you and you're a bad person. No, the point for me of trying to tell the truth is so that we can say, okay, how can we now move forward so that I don't harm you, so that you don't harm me, so that we don't harm the young people that are coming after us. How can we produce literally a more just world? And so, like, it makes me, that kind of intensity of silence is, for me, it is a tell. But also, like, the thing about that silence is that it's a similar kind of silence that the church has traditionally had around queerness, around the AIDS crisis, unless we can talk about AIDS as straight Black women who are contracting it, and then it's a problem that we have to contend with. But if it's just gay men, it's something that we don't have to really think about. It's something that we don't really have to contend with. But and so, like, for me, it's like trying to think about the various ways that the kind of silence that you named, the various ways that silence happens, the various places, the various ranges of that silence in community and in interpersonal relationships, because I think we're so used to it happening, but it's also heartbreaking.
So my last thing to you, what do you want to say to the church around HIV? I know you want to.
Let's go home.
No, yeah, I mean, that's good, because they would be like, okay, but no, what do you really want to say to the church around HIV, around how they treat LGBTQI queer people, around the whole expansiveness of it? What word do you want to say to the church that they need to hear, regardless of whether they receive it or not?
Yeah,
that that they need to hear. This something that would come from you as a son of the church.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're not on the outside, or you haven't been, you grew up in this. You know what it looks like, the bare bones of it. Right? And so now you have come out, you're a scholar, professor, teaching other folks, doing great work, PhD. What do you want to say back to the church now?
I'm gonna yield to Whoopi Goldberg's version of Seeley and say, because I really do think that there is an eternal truth in what Seeley said to Mr. Albert. Until you do right, you're gonna fail. Like that, I think that we are in a moment of the failure. Ooh, do I want to? I'm like, do I want to
this video? Come on, because the thing is that if people don't hear it from you, if people don't hear it from other people like you, how can we get better?
Yeah.
We have this scripture, will thou be made whole? Well, will you? Because we're going to give you a prescription. Are you going to take your medicine?
I will say that I think that we are in a moment of the possibility of the failure of the thing that we have called the Black church. That there is not a protracted and a sustained conversation, for example, about the genocide that is happening in Palestine and the deaths of Palestinians. Because for so many, there is this theological orientation toward the idea that of Israel. So that, for me, is one piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence is the response to COVID, the kind of individualizing and atomizing of COVID as an individual thing that you have to take care of individually. And if you wear masks, it's on you. If you don't wear a mask, it's on you. And the people who die of COVID complications, we're not going to actually say it publicly. We're going to be very quiet about it because there's still a lot of shame. And so I feel like we are in a moment, and joblessness has increased. Job security has decreased. The economy is terrible, regardless of what politicians are saying.
Yeah.
That we are living in other work. Like no one can work 40 hours at a job and pay their rent in terms of minimum wage. People don't make a living wage. There are so many different historical factors happening in our current moment that it seems to me churches are unwilling to actually see. And my algorithm on Instagram continues to show me that mostly what I see, I hope it's not happening everywhere, but what I see is a bunch of people going to church every Sunday to shout. And as a person who has written entire chapters about shouting and love shouting and think shouting is beautiful, that shouting that happens because you don't want to pay attention to what's happening in the world is not useful, helpful, or just. And I feel that we are in a moment where failure might be the thing that is happening more than anything. And so I think that Seeley's words are deeply applicable until we begin to do right, until we begin to do the work of reckoning and truth telling and being historically accurate and telling the truth about the history, telling the truth about loss, until we begin to do the grieving work that is necessary, we will collectively fail. And I think that we see the evidence of what refusing to do those things has actually given us, what it's gifted us. It has gifted us an aesthetic of praise where people can shout, but it hasn't gifted us a practice of justice that is oriented toward the care of the human person.
Yes.
And that for me is the huge, like it absolutely makes no sense. I don't care if you shout or not. I don't care if you speak in tongues or not.
Right.
I don't care if you have choir robes or not. I don't care if you have praise team or sing devotion. If you are not oriented toward the care of the human person in its complexity, including queerness,
yes,
then you are not doing the work of the divine. You're not. And I feel like perhaps Christians are the worst the worst testifiers of who Jesus is supposed to be.
worst representatives, absolutely.
Worst representative.
Sad. Indeed. It's sad, but it is something that needed to be said. I want to thank you.
Thank you.
For your candidness, for your truth, and for your work.
Thank you.
The church needed you then, and they need you now still. Although you're working in other fields, I know that your work will end up coming back to the church. They're going to have to reconcile with themselves. They're going to have to repent. They're going to have to do right by those of our siblings who and family that went on, that died with no recognition, no love, no respect, that we allowed to usher us into the presence of God, the presence of divine.
Yeah.
We spoke in tongue. We fell out. We ran around the church. But when they left us, we wanted to say nothing. We didn't want to have anything to do with them. Mm-hmm. And so that day is coming. I appreciate you so very, very much.
Thank you.
For being here with us on today. And I say to all of you that are watching, make sure that you share this. People need to hear this conversation. People need to know what is really going on and how we can move forward and what the things that need to be done in order for there to be reconciliation, in order for there to be healing. And this is one of the ways. I'm so grateful for Professor Crawley on today. God bless you for joining us and have a great evening.
Thank you, sir.